In 2006, Roger Cox, a Dutch lawyer in private practice in the city of Maastricht, watched Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth. He was horrified at what he learned. With his law partners, he acquired the Dutch distribution rights to the film and organized free screenings all over the Netherlands. Like many others, he had high hopes for the Copenhagen climate change talks in 2009, and he was bitterly disappointed at their failure. The nations of the world had already agreed that climate change directly threatens the human rights of all people and all societies, but the failure of Copenhagen showed clearly that the democratic process alone couldn't possibly avert the looming climate catastrophe. Well then, could citizens sue their governments for failing to take dramatic and timely action to protect their people? That idea is at the heart of Roger Cox's 2011 book, Revolution Justified: Why Only the Law Can Save Us Now. And in 2012, in concert with 900 citizens and a remarkable Dutch organization called the Urgenda Foundation, Roger Cox took the government of the Netherlands to court. Their objective? A ruling that the government had a duty to cut emissions far more dramatically than it had intended. In June 2015, they won, and the ripples of their victory are being felt in courtrooms and legislatures all around the world.
Well, obviously 2009 was the much anticipated summit in Copenhagen, the climate summit in Copenhagen, and everybody expected a lot from that summit. Basically, everybody agreed that that was the final point where we had to agree on an international convention on burden sharing with regard to emission reductions. And if we wouldn't be able to reach such an agreement in Copenhagen, then the staying below 2 degrees would become almost impossible. And then Copenhagen failed. So this much anticipated summit failed, and it became clear that nation states were at this point in time not yet up to the task to keep us below 2 degrees and take the reduction measures and mitigation measures that are necessary for that. And then I thought, well, let's see if there is a way that we can use the law in pressuring governments into more climate action, because you will need nation states to take a coordinate and leading role in transforming our energy systems and transforming society. I think without them and without their lead and coordination, such a transformation is almost impossible. And that's when I started thinking about writing a book about the whole issue, about the issue of climate change and why there's this stalemate position in politics and within the markets around addressing climate change. And so it became clear to me that the nation states of the world were at that point not yet up to the task of agreeing on how to keep us below 2 degrees. And I strongly feel that we need governments to take a leading role and a coordinate role in transforming society to a low carbon society. I don't think you can manage that transition without a leading role of states. And since they were not willing to do that voluntarily, in a way, I thought let's see if we can use the law for creating more pressure on national governments to start implementing adequate climate policies. And that's when I thought of writing the book.
Well, it's a brilliant idea that you in a sense go, if you say I can't come in the front door, I'll come around the side door, but I'll still get into the room by using the courts as opposed to the legislatures.
Yeah, and also from a historic view, from a historic perspective, I thought there is no proof whatsoever that transitions, large-scale transformations in the energy sector can happen without a leading role of governments. If you look at our energy infrastructure in Europe, for instance, all our electricity networks are built by governments. They're not subsidized by governments, they're built by governments. If you look at the power generation, that's also the gas-fired power plants and coal-fired power plants. They've all been built by governments. Only in the recent 10 to 15 years we have been starting to privatize certain coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants. But up to that point, it were the governments that built those infrastructures. And so that shows you that you need them for implementing such a transition.
You have a wonderful kind of anti-neoliberal passage in the book where you say essentially companies don't build economies, governments build economies. You know, governments set the circumstances, governments do the big things, and then the companies work within the framework the government set up. It's a very not a popular viewpoint in North America at this point.
Yeah, it is almost in all Western world has become quite neoliberal in its view on how to develop, evolve, and create society. And most people believe that you can leave that up to the markets, and that, you know, business will run society. But in effect, from a historic perspective, that's absolutely not the case. And the incentives for businesses are not to build a society. The incentives for businesses are to create profits for their shareholders, basically, and, you know, not look at the long-term perspective as such for society, but most of the time look at the short-term interest of the company as such within the context of society. And all large infrastructures, whether it's our roads or our airports or our ports or our electricity networks, etc., or our healthcare systems, our schooling systems, they've all been built by governments. And from those large infrastructures, companies and citizens can start to feed and prosper and develop their own activities.
Your book is quite relentless on some of these points, I think it's a magnificent structure of argument. But you went right back to the start of the issue of the oil decline, and you have a whole relentless passage on that, and then the climate change issue. But you've looked at the implications of those crises. Well, the oil crisis, for example, you're looking at that and saying that oil decline has the potential to unleash a complete breakdown of Western society, economically, socially, and politically. I don't think many people have seen that, and tell me about that. Tell me about how you see that unfold.
Yeah, well, if you look at the oil crisis in the 1970s, you will see that immediately had quite a negative impact on our economies and on mobility within our countries. And we've now seen that we have to start using tar sands and drilling in the Arctic and other deep sea places, for instance, to find the last parts of oil that are available to man, because the larger oil fields are now already mostly in decline. In our Western countries, they are heavily in decline already. If you look at the oil reserves of the Netherlands or Norway or most developed countries, these reserves are drastically declining, as are our reserves also in other parts of the world. And obviously there's also some increases. If you're looking at the position of the United States, for instance, they had an increase now in oil development. But these are mostly very difficult reserves that are very difficult to develop. They need a lot of investments. They need a high oil price to do so. And it seems that this is just a short-term increase. Most prognoses are that around 2020 we'll see a decline in those newfound reserves as well. And we have to understand that basically our whole globalized world is still running on oil. That's the basic fuel that we use for mobility around the world. So once we will find ourselves in a perpetual decline of oil exploration, then that could lead to harsh consequences for our society.
Well, when you talk about two things, I guess number one, when you wrote the book, you were expecting the decline to happen much sooner than
Absolutely.
that. Yeah? And so a bit surprising, but it's only a delay. It's not a change in the structure of the situation.
Exactly.
But you also see it as having the potential to cause great human rights violations, which is partly the lever that gets you into the courts, right? Tell me about the human rights violations that come from declining oil.
Well, the situation is this: once a heavy decline of oil exploration would occur, you will find that transporting our goods around the world will become much more expensive because of the costs of oil. If you look at agricultural production, we use oil at all levels of production, be it from using fertilizer as an oil-derived product to using the machinery to harvest the land, the transportation of the goods to markets, the use of freezers for keeping them stored for a certain period of time, the plastics for it to pack it, people running their cars to the supermarkets to fetch the food, etc. So once oil would become more expensive, you will see that within all those aspects, costs will rise. That will make food and other products, obviously, in the first instance, a lot more costly. And in the end of the day, even if that would drag on, mobility would as such shrink, because you would have not enough oil available for getting all the goods transported around the world. And that could lead to shortages in food and other basic needs for people, for instance, which would in itself create health effects or other impoverishment of societies.
So basically, the right to live a reasonable and comfortable and secure life is what's at risk, right?
If we don't transform timely to another fuel that could be used as an alternative for oil, I think that we in the next decades ahead we will definitely hit a wall with oil production, and oil decline would certainly have grave impacts on societies around the world if we do not have an alternative in place by that time.
Which might lead to things like food-based or climate-based refugee floods, such as Europe's experiencing now from the Syrian war, right?
Exactly. Looking at the Syrian refugee crisis, there's already proof that is partly related to the changing of our climate between 2007 and 2011. Syria was hit by the longest and heaviest drought that was ever recorded in Syria, making a lot of farmers have to leave the rural areas of Syria and going to the cities, where they ended up in poverty, creating a sort of hotspot for social unrest. And that social unrest in itself has led to instability within Syria, with all the consequences that it has now. Obviously, there are also other what's the word here? Causes. Yeah, exactly. There are also other causes in relation to the crisis in Syria that might even be more predominant than climate change. But there is already some scientific proof that climate change does have an influence on the situation in Syria and the resulting refugee crisis. So you can expect to see a lot more of this happening in decades ahead, because what we really need to understand, I think, is that what we see happening in the world today, like the crisis in Syria, which is partly related to climate change, like the melting of our polar ice cap and the melting of our glaciers and the more extreme droughts and intenser heat waves, more bushfires, etc. Those are all the results of emissions of about up to 1980, because there's a delay between emissions on the one hand and the warming of our world on the other hand. It's a delay of about 30 to 50 years. So what we see now is the result of the emissions of up to 1980. And what we will see happening in the next decades will be the results of the emissions that have been emitted after 1980 and until today, which will warm our world a lot more even than has already occurred. And then we also know that the next decades we will discharge a lot more emissions into the atmosphere, because basically we haven't started with our energy transition yet, and we'll be relying on fossil fuels for the next decades even, emitting a lot more CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So that's why we almost know for sure that if we don't start reducing emissions in large quantities and start doing that now, that our world will be a lot more warmer than 2 degrees at the end of this century. And the outlook for refugee crises and other extreme events in our weather patterns around the world will be so much more visible and extreme than what we are experiencing today. And that's basically what we need to prevent.
Before we leave the oil thing itself, which, I mean, the climate thing is a constant, in a sense they're two sides of the same coin, aren't they? An excessive dependency on fossil fuels, and it has political impacts on the side of the oil decline, and climatic and other impacts on the other side. But one of the things that you said in the book that I think is worth pulling out just on its own is you said the Western world's addiction to oil means that we are in effect at war with ourselves when we talk about wars on terrorism. And you also talk about selling out the constitutional state. Can we just touch on those before we move on?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you look at our oil dependency, except for the situation now in the United States, which is trying to become more oil independent because of its newly found fossil fuel reserves. But if you look at the rest of the world and our dependence on oil, it makes us more and more reliant on the Middle East states and North African states, which are the most stable states right now in the world, where also the main source of extremism, Islamic extremism, is found in Saudi Arabia and Iran and other countries in that area. And we keep on feeding them with a lot of money because we're so reliant on their resources. And basically the extremism in itself is a result of our past interventions in those countries because of those oil reserves, and because our oil companies and our governments did want to have a grip on those reserves, and therefore also power and influence on the governments within those countries. So we've even been overturning governments as Western nations in that region of the world because we wanted to have a large influence on how those countries are run, and because that made it possible for us and our oil companies to explore and exploit those oil reserves.
So as we're paying the governments, we're paying often quite radical governments and people within those countries, which are in turn financing, fundamentalist Islamic fundamentalists, with whom we are in conflict on the other side,
we're
right?
in conflict, yeah. And that making a transformation to renewable energy, for instance, which is sourced within your own region. If you look at wind and solar and tidal energy, etc., makes us a lot more independent from those regions than we are right now, and that would create more stability in the world.
Now, the tendency in the neoliberal world is to say the market will deal with this. And I think you show quite convincingly that the market is structured in such a way that it can't possibly deal with this. Is that?
The market is the oil market as such is not a free market at all. It's heavily regulated by governments. There's a lot of governmental influence on that. If you look at the history of of oil companies, they obviously were in a position to explore within other territories in the world, because basically we were running at that point in time, at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century, we had all those colonies around the world, and within those colonies our governments sort of gave free way to the established oil companies to do their thing, and so there's been a lot of cooperation between our governments and oil companies in creating the oil business. Oil is very heavily subsidized around the world. It's the most subsidized energy source that we have. The estimates are about $400 to $500 billion per year on subsidies. So it's not, as such, it's not a free market at all.
You also quote Lord Stern, though, and Lord Stern says this is the greatest market failure in history because the consequences of the actions are so far divorced in time and space from the benefits of it that, in a sense, the costs are way down the road and paid by somebody else. Right?
Yeah, well, I think that what Stern meant is that because of the delay in emissions on the one hand and the warming effect 30 or 50 years later on the other hand, that means that whatever we do at this point in time, it will not change what will happen in the next few decades. Because what will happen in the next few decades will be the results of the emissions of the last few decades. So whatever we do, the warming that we will see in the next few decades will be there anyways. So even if we start to take drastic action and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we will still see a lot more warming in the next few decades. And markets and politicians are obviously very much reliant on taking action now and see the results within 1 or 2 or 3 years, because you want to be re-elected or you want to show to your shareholders that you did well as management and that you generated profits. Well, the problem with climate change is that what we will do now will only bear fruit in the second part of this century, and which is such a long-term perspective that it's not a very interesting incentive for markets or for politicians to start acting upon it, because it will be other politicians down the road and other governments down the road and other managements within those companies down the road in 30 or 40 or 50 years time that will start seeing the fruit of the actions that we will implement today. And that is why Stern indeed said that climate change is the biggest market failure there is, because markets are not up to the task of coping with such a long-term problem, which only generates the effects intended in the long term and not in the short term.
In a sense, our prices are too low now because they don't take into account the costs, because the costs are so far away and will actually be borne by somebody else. If we were paying the true cost of oil, it wouldn't be even $100 a barrel, right?
It would be a lot more, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, all right, so the market's not going to solve it.
No.
And you have a whole section in the book called The Failure of Democracy. Tell me about how democracies, and you've also said something else that was, I wanted to quote. It is not technology that has failed Western society, but first and foremost the market and the democratic system.
Yeah, well, the problem with these long-term issues like climate change is that our focus in this neoliberal world is very much short-term based, and it's very much based on individual action. So the basic idea of governments is, strangely enough, that governments should be as small as possible and have as least influence as possible on society, because markets can rule the world, because markets react on individual interests, and if everybody would be looking for his own individual interest, then that would generate the most efficient and world there is. And that would create a prosperous society for all, if everybody would be looking internally and looking to serve his own interests. That whole system obviously makes it very difficult to cope with a long-term problem, where you cannot generate the outcomes that you're looking for in the short term, but only in the long term. So that's the first problem that you have with our current system. And the same goes for politics. Politicians get elected every 2, 4, 6 years. Once they are in office, they want to show results immediately, because only by showing results you have a shot of becoming re-elected again. So that's the first hindrance for addressing a problem, long-term problem like climate change. The other problem, obviously, is that our governments, together with the fossil fuel industry, have been creating the world that we're currently in, and have been doing so for the last 150 years, making the fossil fuel industry the biggest industry that the world has ever seen. Much of the fossil fuel companies have turnovers that are a lot larger than most national incomes of countries. They have an enormous amount of revenues, they have an enormous amount of power and political power. They have enormous resources to activate lobby activism, to work on our political system. There are 5 to 10 times more lobbyists in the car industry in Brussels than there are civil servants in Brussels, for instance. So that makes it there's an enormous political power there. There's also an enormous societal power, because obviously they're also one of the largest employees in our society. So once their business is threatened, these companies threaten to lay off people, which in turn creates a lot of pressure from employees in the direction of politics to do something about the issue. Our banks are obviously heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, because basically they're the biggest industry, have the biggest outstanding loans, they have the biggest capital goods that need to be financed, like oil refineries, oil rigs, pipelines, oil tankers, etc. Those are the biggest capital goods we have. So our banks also are very much involved in the fossil fuel industry. So looking at that triangle, if you will, between our big banks, our big fossil fuel companies and our governments, that obviously is a system that has no incentive whatsoever to turn over the fossil fuel system and create a new renewable energy system that is contrary to the interests of the fossil fuel industry. So looking at where we stand now, looking at this particular triangle, looking at the short-term interest that is still predominant, the driving force behind our political and business actions, that makes it almost impossible to address this long-term climate change problem that needs, in effect, that needs the oil industry to be phased out in the next decades, creating a sort of conflict between the biggest industry that we have, between our banks, our governments on the one hand, and this long-term interest that needs to be served on the other hand. And that is why, looking at the climate problem, we have this proof that we have a UN climate convention already in place since 1992. We're 23 years down the road now. The problem has only gotten worse. There seems not to be a solution yet to that problem, while the window of opportunity for addressing that problem is rapidly closing. And that's why I think that looking at this particular problem and looking how the world is run today, from a market side and a political side, that the system is failing us, and that we need, in fact, a pressure from civil society on the one hand, and pressure from the third power within our society, the judiciary, on the other hand, to create this pressure on our governments to start implementing adequate climate policies that serve the long-term interest.
And this, I think, is where you've had the brilliant perception that has brought us together here, which is that there's, I think a lot of people would understand much of what you've just said in terms of the triangle of large bodies that are interacting and form a system that, and it makes people feel quite desperate. They look at that and they say, yeah, this is a prescription for disaster, and there's nothing within that system that you can get hold of to change that. But you've seen the long-term an approach through the judiciary, and that to me is one of the most fabulous insights that anyone could have come up with. But tell me a little bit about how that works, because how do you get purchase? How do you get leverage within the judicial system to deal with an issue like this, which lots of people would say is intrinsically a political issue, right?
Yeah, that should be your basic thought. I think that everybody would think that climate change is basically a political issue because of all the consequences that addressing the problem will have on society. I think that was my starting point also. But then looking at the situation that we just described, you see that because we are in this sort of deadlock, stalemate kind of situation right now, where we know based on science that something drastically needs to shift and change within society on the one hand, and you see this mechanism that prevents this change from happening, making the consequences becoming alive that climate change will become a danger in the future for humankind as such. And then you start wondering, well, okay, if this system is failing us and if it creates this big of danger, a danger that will create a lot of casualties in the second part of this century, which will create a lot of damage within society, then you start to enter into the legal domain, because damages and casualties and other dangers that are created to men are definitely something that the judiciary can cope with. And so that basically was the starting point, I think, for myself, to start looking at what the law as such and the judiciary could mean for creating and helping to create this transition. And once you see, looking at the triangle and seeing this huge power that this triangle is in fact within society, so our governments, the fossil fuel industry and our banks, then as an individual, if you want to do something about it, you have to look at another power structure. So I think my starting point, the first starting point probably was, I have to first find as an individual a power structure that I can activate that might be as influential as the power structure that prevents the change from happening. And then looking at our legal system and at the judiciary, I thought, well, there's a lot of wisdom within that system. It's a powerful system because our democracies are based on the rule of law. It is the third power within, one of the three powers within our society, next to the legislator and the executive power. So why not find a way to get this third power involved in this climate change debate? And the only way to get them involved is to find a way to bring a suit to court. Because the judiciary can obviously not become active itself on behalf of itself. It needs cases that are brought before courts for it to become active, and that's basically when I started to think of how could we get the legal system and the judiciary involved. And then looking at the legal system as such, your basic idea would be to rely on environmental law, for instance, or international law. But looking at environmental law, basically you apply environmental law once you see that certain industrial activities, for instance, are not in compliance with the legislations and other rules that are made for protecting the environment. But the case with climate change is that there actually are no adequate environmental regulations in place that you can rely on. So basically looking at environmental law, you can maybe use it to postpone the initiatives to create new coal-fired power plants, for instance, because the developments do not comply with certain regulations. So you can attack that, but basically it will give the operator the opportunity to correct it. And once they can comply again with the regulation, then these coal-fired power plants will still be built and will still be operated. So you can postpone certain action by using environmental law, but you cannot deny those developments. So basically environmental law, I thought, is not up to the task because the regulation is not such that it can prevent dangerous climate change from happening, because we do not have environmental regulation that has the purpose to prevent dangerous climate change. So that was a road that I thought could best not be traveled. And looking at international law, because it is an international problem, one of the first basic thoughts would be, let's see what international law can do for you. But international law can only be activated by nation states. So that would mean that a citizens or an NGO could not activate international law directly. So that was also a road that I thought was not the way forward. And a third road that we best not travel, I thought, is the road of arguing that there needs to be new regulation in place. Because of all the lobby activism of fossil fuel industry and other industries, you will see that new regulation that creates the possibility of a really large shift within society and therefore hurt the conventional interest of the fossil fuel industry and other industries will be so heavily lobbied that they probably will never be enacted anyways. So that's also a road I thought that we best not take. So basically that leaves you with looking at the existing law to be used as a lever for pressuring governments into more climate action. And if you want to activate the judiciary and give the judiciary as much maneuvering room as possible within the legal system, then you best look at a sort of open legal norms that can be implemented by the judiciary by looking at all the circumstances that are involved in the particular case. And that's when I thought the best open norm that I can think of that leaves the most maneuvering room for the judiciary to look at the circumstances of the climate change case and start acting upon it is in fact the basic legal notion of the duty of care, meaning that it is not allowed for anybody within society, not for us as citizens, not for a company, but also not for a public or political institution like our nation states, to create a harm for others that has a certain gravity to it and that can be prevented without being too onerous for our states to act upon it. And that's basically when the whole idea started to start instituting legal proceedings against nation states based on their violation of the duty of care against their citizens to prevent future drastic and grave harm from happening by keeping on contributing to dangerous climate change.
And that's the counterpart of that is human rights, right? That if seen from the one side, the nation state has a duty of care. Seen from the other side, the human being has rights. Yeah. And that's kind of like the arena in which you finally went to war. Right?
That's exactly because the whole case is basically the basis is the duty of care, but looking at the effects that climate change will have if that duty of care is not complied with by nation states, you will see that the effects of climate change within every region of the world, including our own region, is so drastic that the consequences of climate change will indeed be the infringement of basic human rights, such as the right to life, the right to water, the right to a undisturbed private life, etc. And the thing is that all our nation states, all 195 countries that are a signatory party to the UN Climate Convention, have also acknowledged this in 2010 in the Cancun agreements, in which they have stated that they acknowledge that climate change will have a detrimental effect in all regions of the world on the effective enjoyment of human rights. And those Cancun agreements are also very relevant in another way, because there it has also been established that a 2-degree warming of the average temperature of the Earth will indeed become dangerous for humankind and the ecosystems that humans depend on. So taking them together, you know that bringing us over the threshold of 2 degrees will constitute large-scale infringement of human rights all around the world, including within our own Western countries. And that gives you sort of a good starting point for starting legal action. And the interesting part then is that using this open norm of the duty of care and pointing out to the threat of the real and imminent threat of human rights infringements around the world also gives the courts the maneuvering room to start implementing indirectly the agreements that have been made on an international level. Because with the open norm of the duty of care, you can start to look at all circumstances of the case, including what consensus has been reached upon in the international community of countries on certain aspects of climate change, like the 2-degree threshold, for instance.
You look at it and you think, if the nations had understood, in a sense, I mean, it almost sounds as though at Cancun everybody said, well, yes, we can agree, though. This is what the science says, yes, 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 we stroke our chins. And this is the implications of it, yes, 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 but we don't have to do anything. We can agree to all of this, not realizing that somebody could come out of Maastricht and say, but you do have to do something about this, right?
Yeah, I don't think that was expected. No. I don't. And it's not that they have agreed on all these aspects. For instance,
but they've agreed on major facts.
But they have agreed on the facts that are relevant. And if everybody is in agreement in the world on a certain fact, then that fact becomes does have some legal relevance, obviously. If the whole world agrees that a warming of 2 degrees of the average temperature of the Earth is a danger for mankind, then why there is no other possibility for a court than taking that as a starting point. Okay, everybody seems to be in agreement that we should be below 2 degrees, so let's take that as a starting point.
Including the defendant government has also agreed to that.
Including the defendant government, and that's also something that I've already been describing and stating in my book, is that one of maybe the best reasons to go to court is to get rid of this silly media discussion around climate change and climate science, that it's not settled science yet, that it's all out in the open still, if it's man-made, if it constitutes a danger, if it's related to greenhouse gases or not. If you have a discussion like that in court, I already said in my book, there will be no discussion on the climate science, because the climate science is clear, and courts are are maybe the best organizations in place that we have within society to look at evidence, because that's what courts do, they look at evidence. So I always said, let's bring the climate science to court, because you will see that in the courts the climate science will be accepted as it is, because the certainties around climate change are at a very, very high level. And indeed, there was no room for our state to deny the climate science as presented by the IPCC. And the Dutch state didn't even try to deny that science and accepted that science fully and completely. Which is not very strange, because if you look at that science, we know for 100% sure that the Earth is warming since the Industrial Revolution. We know for 100% sure that greenhouse gases and CO2 have risen quite dramatically since the Industrial Revolution. And we know for 95% sure or more that those two 100% certainties are connected to one another, meaning that the warming that is observed in the world today is indeed the result of the increase of man-made greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So those are very high percentages on scientific certainty. And we also know for more than 90% sure that a 2-degree warming of the world will have adverse effects in all regions of the world. So the whole world will be affected by a warming of more than 2-degree rise. Now, in court, that is pretty convincing scientific evidence, and so you can build a case on that.
So what are you asking the court to do when you go into court and you say, here's the situation, this is, this is established scientific fact. What are you saying the court, what are you asking the court to rule?
Yeah, well, basically you ask for two things. First of all, look at the science, look at what has been acknowledged on the world stage as being dangerous. Look at what the derived reduction targets should be based on science and also as acknowledged by all industrialized nations in the world. And make a declaration that not contributing not doing your part as a nation state to keeping us below 2 degrees constitutes a tort, is a negligent action in a way. So first you ask for a declaration that current climate policies by, in this case, the Dutch nation state are inadequate and therefore also unlawful, and ask the court to label them as hazardous negligence and as a violation of the state duty of care. So that would be the first request. And then secondly, we requested to impose a duty on the state to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a rate that is consistent with what is necessary based on science and as acknowledged by the nations of the world as being necessary to contribute to staying below 2 degrees.
And what the state is supposed to be doing is reducing by quite a significant percentage as viewed against the 1990 levels of emissions. What does it actually come to in terms of when they come to the specific ruling? What do they actually ask for, or what do they actually demand?
Yeah, what we actually ask for is that there have to be reductions between 25 to 40% in 2020 already, relative to the levels of 1990, which are quite ambitious reduction targets. But these reduction targets are necessary from all developed countries in the world if we want to have a 50% chance of actually staying below 2 degrees. And these numbers have also been acknowledged by all developed countries. So each developed country knows that this is something it should do, or that the countries as joint parties should achieve before 2020. But none of them are. A few exceptions are there, like Denmark and Germany, for instance. They voluntarily have set targets of 40% reductions in 2020 already, and they're well on their way to achieving those targets. So it's also possible. So we have proof that nation states can reduce within this target range, and even the upper target of 40% reductions in 2020, and prosper as an economy, have prosperous companies, etc. So there's proof that it can be done, but most nation states aren't. The Dutch aren't, the Canadians aren't, the US isn't, the same as for Australia, for most European countries. So except for a few front runners, nobody's actually, while knowing what needs to be done, nobody's doing what needs to be done. And therefore that's what we're requesting the courts to impose on our states.
And how does the government respond to that? Because as you lay it out, I'm struck by the same thing I was struck by in reading your book, which is that the structure of the argument is just relentless. There's no holes in it, there's no wiggle room, it's based on scientific fact that's been well established and acknowledged even by the people who are not paying attention to it. What kind of a defense can the state mount against a lawsuit of that kind?
Yeah, states will say anything that's necessary to keep them from getting a negative ruling. But basically, our state said a few things. Well, first of all, they acknowledged the climate science, which obviously is a first big step also for the court, because it makes the life of the court a lot easier, because there's consensus by both parties, the state and the claimants, on the climate science. So that's a good starting point. But from that on, the state has mainly argued that it didn't feel that this was a legal question, that basically it's political discretion to deal with climate change and to set targets, that there's no such thing as a binding international rule, although certain things and facts have been acknowledged, that the acknowledgements as such cannot create a legal obligation. So that was a main argument, and obviously they will state that all requirements that need to be addressed before a court can say that a government acts in a tortious way, that all these requirements were not met from a legal perspective. But that's a whole legal discussion. It becomes too detailed from a legal perspective to discuss this now. But you have to address certain requirements before a court can conclude that there is indeed a tort of negligence or any other infringement of the law. But we were able to convince the court that all requirements are met based on very sound, solid factual and legal reasoning. So I don't think that it's a very exotic legal exercise. The exotic part is only that it is a legal exercise related to one of the biggest questions that we have. Obviously it is an international dilemma, it's an international problem, and it should be solved on an international scale, which was also one of the main arguments of the state. Even if the Dutch would do what is necessary, the climate problem will still evolve in a way that climate change will become dangerous for mankind. So there is no causation between the actions of the Dutch government on the one hand, or preventing them to act in that way, and the development towards dangerous climate change on the other hand. But here again, as the Supreme Court in the United States has also already said, the Dutch court ruled that it is obvious that it is an international problem, but it can only be solved if every country takes its individual responsibility. And so there is no excuse to be pointing to other countries. There is an individual responsibility to do your part within your national boundaries to keep us safe as a world and to keep us below 2 degrees.
Now, the argument that this is a matter for the legislatures and for democratic decision-making rather than legal decision-making, am I right, and would it be right to phrase it and say that bolt hole for the state is blocked by the fact that this has to do with rights, not, right? And so, you know, the democratic processes don't alter your rights.
Exactly, yeah, and that's also what the court said, is that while looking at the separation of powers, we have as a court a constitutional duty to answer legal questions that are raised before our courts. So our first main task is to define whether there's a legal question raised or not. And with regard to the dangers of climate change and whether or not you can contribute to knowingly and willingly to creating that danger, that poses a legal question according to the court. And once a legal question is raised, then the court has to answer that question. So that's basically a statutory duty that courts have within our country. And courts in a way are also have a democratic legitimacy because our legislation, our statutes do create this legal obligation for our courts, and these statutes and legislation has been created by our parliaments of the past. And that's basically what our laws are. These are decisions of parliaments of the past, and therefore have a democratic basis as such. So there's already some democratic legitimacy in what our courts do. And then looking at the third part, because you create a lot of consequences by ruling the way the court did, you create a lot of consequences for society as a whole, not just for the Dutch state, but for society as a whole. And the court did say that, you know, this means that we have to take some caution into account because of these external effects that this ruling will have to other parts of society as well. But that we have to balance against the risk of that a 2-degree warming of the average temperature of the Earth poses for the Dutch society and societies around the world. And looking at the gravity of that danger, we do not feel that we have to restrain ourselves by not ordering or imposing a duty on the Dutch government to do its contribution. So it's a sort of balancing act between the political discretion on the one hand, but the political discretion is as such not unlimited. Political discretion does not mean that you can actively and knowingly and willingly create a humongous danger for the society that you're basically ruling. And that's basically what the court found.
It's a deeply moral finding, isn't it? That you know you were elected to take care of business for these people, to ensure their safety and security, and to what extent you can their prosperity, and you haven't done it.
And you haven't done it. Yeah, exactly. And that's also what some political parties said after the ruling is, well, in fact, we should be ashamed as a political power that we need a court to point out to us that we have an obligation to protect our citizens against such grave danger. And that was maybe the most optimistic part of it all, I think, is that after the ruling, a lot of political parties in Parliament said, well, you know, let's not appeal this case. It's pretty clear what needs to be done. We've always acknowledged what needs to be done. Let's just get on with it and start implementing these emission reductions.
But there is an appeal.
There is an appeal. There's a parallel course that the government is now following. First of all, there is an appeal on principal legal grounds, but on the other hand, they will comply with the verdict, and they have said to Parliament, on request of Parliament, that they will present a plan in the beginning of next year, so in the beginning of 2016, to show how they will meet this new set target by the court in 2020. So our climate policies have already changed due to this court ruling, because first we had a 16% reduction target for 2020, and now we have at least a 25% reduction target for 2020.
Yeah, so they're in effect saying, we think there's a legal argument that the court shouldn't have forced this upon us, but since they have, we're going forward with it. But we still want to settle the legal aspect for use in other circumstances later on.
Yeah, and one of the basic reasons for that is that government is afraid that this intervention of the court might also spill over to other policy fields, and that's why they feel that some principal questions have to be raised before a higher court. My personal opinion is I don't think that will spill over to other policy fields, because climate change, I think, is a very unique issue for several reasons. First of all, because of the scientific status of climate change, which is pretty much settled. Then looking at the consensus around the world on what constitutes dangerous climate change, again the 2-degree thresholds that we've been discussing already. The acknowledgement of what needs to be done by industrial nations to keep a good chance of staying below 2 degrees has also been acknowledged. And then maybe the most important part is there's only one measure you can take for keeping us below 2 degrees, and that is mitigating greenhouse gas reductions. So there's not much political debate possible on what the solution to the problem is. While if you look at other policy fields like healthcare or education or what have you, there will certainly be very relevant questions that can be raised within all those policy fields, but there will never be one single solution to that to that question, and that thing, I think, makes climate change such a unique issue because of all these facts. So I'm not afraid that this ruling can spill over to other policy fields.
Not such a bad thing if it did, in a way, because this is not just a legal matter. This is also, I mean, you went to court on behalf of a foundation and 900 plus citizens, right?
Yeah.
And that's an aspect that we skipped over that I'd like to come back to for just a moment. There was such a thing as crowd pleading, and you had this whole body of, I mean, from a lawyer's point of view, this must have been a very complex clientele, right? Yeah. How did that work?
Well, the idea of crowd pleading was that everybody who thought he had relevant input that could be used in this particular case could bring that forward, and then we as a legal team would have a look at it and see if we could integrate it already in the draft of the summons that we had put online. So we made a draft of the summons that would be served on the state, put it online, and gave everybody who wanted to have input on that summons the possibility to point out certain things that we should maybe integrate, or point out certain reports that we had not used yet, etc. So we generated quite some valuable information via that route, and then adopted our draft along those lines, and then served the summons upon the state.
So this is really a democratic legal procedure, isn't it? I mean, there's a democratic aspect to it right at the foundation of before you even go to court.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's very, and of course the other thing about this is that if you don't have a client, if there isn't a body of citizens, or at least one, but one or more citizens that are willing to do something about this, the court's hands are tied, right?
The court's hands are tied, because if there's no case that's brought before the courts cannot intervene into the debate, and that's what I've been saying all along, and also I've been saying in my book, is I think that the basic moral duty is to at least bring a case to court. So the judiciary as a power within our democracy can be involved in this issue of climate change, which is the biggest issue at hand, I think, in this decade and in this century. And however the court may rule, the court will rule. It's not upon us to decide what the outcome of the case should be. Obviously, we have our preference, and we will do our utmost to get the ruling that we want. But the basic success of the case was already bringing a case to court, so we could get the judiciary involved. So even if we would have lost the case, we would still feel pretty good about what we did, because at least we gave the opportunity of courts becoming engaged and involved in the climate change debate. And I think that's maybe the most important part of our initiative, is that it created the possibility for the court to get involved in this issue.
And that's a broad lesson that we can all learn something from, right? I mean, it may be that climate change is unique as a case, but it's not the only issue that we face, and maybe not the only issue that it would be well to have ventilated in court. I mean, if Parliament's not dealing with it, if there's this gridlock of the system that we've been describing, maybe there are other issues that should be tackled in the same way. You might not get the same result, but you would certainly get some thinking and some discussion about it.
Yeah, could be. It all depends on what cases it would be. Obviously, I do feel that climate change has a few unique aspects to it that make it urgent to bring those cases to court. I think that the gravity of the danger is certainly one of them. And that also brings it's the gravity of the danger involved that brings the courts in a position to intervene, I think. So basically, if you can convey the message to our courts how science and international politics views the issue of climate change and the gravity involved in it. Once a court really understands what climate change is all about and what the dangerous consequences are, I think that courts will be pretty much open to the suggestion that they have a role to play and that they should intervene in this stalemate, this deadlock situation that our political system is in relation to climate change.
There might also be actions taken against companies, right? Where a company is knowingly endangering the health and well-being of people that its actions affect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the point will come closer in which we will be able to get a positive ruling against companies as well. And that is because you see that a lot of fossil fuel companies have now, in the last year or last 1.5 years, sent open letters to society in relation to what is also related to as the carbon bubble debate, meaning in effect that if we want to stay below 2 degrees, 4/5 of all the fossil fuel reserves that are already financially activated on the balance sheets of fossil fuel companies need to stay underground, so cannot be used anymore, meaning that a lot of the assets of fossil fuel companies will become stranded if we really make work of the 2-degree target. And that has to do with the financial valuation of fossil fuel companies. And these new facts also made it almost a necessity for them to react to these new findings. They did not deny, if you look at the open letter from Shell, for instance, Shell oil company, to society, you see that they don't deny these facts. So they don't deny the 2-degree target that is necessary to stay below 2. They don't deny the science as such, but what they're basically saying is our assets will nevertheless not become stranded because governments around the world will not be able to regulate us quickly enough to stay below 2 degrees. So we expect the world to be a lot more warmer by the end of the century than 2 degrees. And because governments cannot regulate us that quickly, our assets will not become stranded, and so we will keep on doing our business as usual in a way. And I think that position already creates more liability for fossil fuel companies, because on the one hand they accept the science, they accept the danger, and their only excuse in a way is, well, we will not act unless we are regulated upon. And since there will be no regulation in place quickly enough, we feel free to keep on a business as usual trajectory and do as we please. And I think that the acknowledgement on the one hand of the danger, and on the other hand saying that well, as long as we're not regulated, we won't take any individual responsibility, I think that in the end might create liabilities for those countries. Because if you look at, for instance, asbestos, the asbestos liabilities of the past, companies were all, looking back in the past, companies were already liable as of 1969 for not protecting their employers against asbestos. Asbestos creates, once you inhale asbestos particles, it creates diseases that are quite deadly. At that point in 1969 there was no regulation in the world whatsoever with regard to asbestos, but the fact that companies did know about the danger was already enough for Supreme Courts later on in the 1980s, when all these people actually became ill, to in retrospect rule that companies had already a duty to protect their employers, notwithstanding the fact that there was no governmental regulation in place with regard to asbestos. So the fact that there is no regulation in place will prove to be not a good defensive argument, I think, for fossil fuel companies to keep on doing what they're doing. And so in the near future, I think we will definitely see successful climate cases against fossil fuel companies as well.
Well, that's a scandalously immoral position to take, isn't it? I mean, the only reason for a corporation to exist is because it is in some way serving the welfare of human beings, and if it is knowingly serving the welfare of the abstraction of a profit over real human beings, does it have any right to continue to live?
Well, the companies themselves will argue that they have this right to live, and that they actually have a legal right and even a legal obligation to look after the interest of their shareholders and their employers or employees. So there's a counter argument to be made, but I think again, like we've seen with the Dutch climate case, I think that there are individual responsibilities on governments, but also on large fossil fuel companies, I think, with relation to climate change, because of the simple fact of the gravity of the consequences of climate change in the near future. And I think that the gravity of the situation and the fact that these companies know about this situation and know that these consequences will be grave for humanity, that will make that they have in the end a legal obligation to start acting on their own behalf and taking their own individual responsibility to transform as a business to a new perspective and a new energy company, which relies on technologies that will be beneficial to mankind and will not hurt mankind in the long run.
One last point, and you touched on this, and I'm not quite sure that I have a good, precise question about it, but you were quite indignant about the media and about the fact that the media, who should be informing us, are actually obscuring the real situation by pretending there's still a debate when really in the scientific world there is no such debate. That's another dereliction of duty, isn't it? And I'm wondering if there's any way that a case such as this could roll out to basically say to the media, you know, you guys have a responsibility here too. We may not be able to get at you legally, or maybe we can in some way, I don't know. But is there any way to use this to kind of do some correction with the media?
Well, we've been arguing once we had a successful verdict quite publicly and openly that you know, let's now stop having these discussions in the media whether climate change is real and whether the climate science is settled on the fact whether it's man-made or not. That this court ruling shows us that the evidence has been valued by our courts, and the ruling is quite clear on that aspect. It is man-made. It will have huge consequences for society. So let's skip the whole debate on climate science, and let's now start have media discussions and a media debate on how to transform society to a carbon neutral society in the next decades. So we've definitely tried to use that verdict to get that message across to the media also, to stop this debate that is no debate anymore, but which is just media fun of having a discussion where people are set up against one another and have different opinions, because that's mostly what talk shows are all about, is have discussion. But there is no discussion in climate science on what causes climate change and what the gravity of the situation is.
I say it's a bit like having a discussion of whether or not you believe in gravity. Right?
It's a perfect example. That is basically what it is. Denying climate change as man-made, and denying the gravity of it is something similar as denying gravity. I agree. Yeah.
When that decision came down, it must have been an incredibly powerful moment for you.
I think it was for everybody involved and as attending that courtroom at that moment. It was a huge victory and a very impressive moment. Also because the way that the court had built up its reasoning, that it made public, which is a sort of summary of the written verdict as such. It was a very powerful way in the way the court pronounced that verdict, and we knew that it could become a historic moment if the court would rule in our favor. And once it became clear that the court would rule in our favor, that obviously stirred the emotions quite a bit with all involved, including myself. Yeah.
Roger Cox and his colleagues couldn't have won the climate change case without a remarkable client, the Urgenda Foundation. We've already posted our interview with Dutch lawyer Femke Weidekoop, who was a litigant in the case, and we've also interviewed Marianne Monesma, the dynamic woman who runs the Urgenda Foundation and operates it as if it were an entrepreneurial company. Along with several other interviews with brilliantly innovative lawyers, these conversations form part of Green Rights, our multimedia project about the human right to a healthy environment. For more information about that exciting initiative, visit www.greenrights.com. For that project, and for the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.